Years ago in Paris, I saw a painting I could not stop thinking about. I was obsessed. It was from the 1800s, but it felt like a glimpse of the future that even I had yet to live yet. This is Paul Signac's In the Time of Harmony, and in it, I see ease, but not laziness. People are working, caring for each other. They're communing, but they're not bracing either. There's effort, but it's rooted in liberty and authenticity, not toil. What would it feel like to live like this, centered around dignity instead of urgency? Could knowing ourselves deeply actually strengthen community instead of tending toward isolation, distraction, and doom scrolling? Signac made me feel like this was a timeline we could choose, a possibility just ahead. And when I looked at history more closely, something really interesting revealed itself. There's a realistic optimism in this painting, in spite of the immense change of industrialization that was sweeping through Paris in the 1890s. What I didn't realize then, but I can see now, is that Signac was painting during upheaval, not after it. Industrialization was reshaping work, power, and everyday life. Man was facing off against machine, political tension was ripe, and power structures were crumbling. When I look at moments like this in history, I'm not trying to make predictions. I believe too much in free will. Instead, I'm listening for echoes, clues about how humans responded when the ground shifted beneath their very feet. Because when the foundation feels like quicksand, imagining anything beyond mere survival starts to feel irresponsible. But something interesting happens in moments like that. The imagination is often treated as indulgent precisely when it becomes most necessary, not as an escape, but as a way to engage with and respond to the present moment of chaos. What if hope isn't denial, but participation? Another artist in the same place and time, though, tells a very different story. Meet Georges Seurat and his work Le Grand Jatte, which depicts leisure that looks strangely like work. Bodies are rigid, clothes are stiff, everyone's facing the same direction. It's the very portrait of performative homogeneity. Recreation time exists, sure, but it's regulated and alienating. If Signac shows us what integrative freedom could feel like, Seurat shows us what freedom feels like before it's learned how to live in the body. Seurat holds up an uncomfortable mirror, naming what happens when freedom escapes hardship but doesn't yet know what to move toward. Desire, expression, juiciness, beauty. Seurat isn't condemning modern progress, he's witnessing its distortion. And when I look at history, I notice that relieving oppression doesn't automatically teach us how to live well. That requires integrating, healing, and rebuilding together. And that is where Signac enters the conversation. Some say Signac is escapist or naive, but he was an anticipator. He's saying, yep, Houston, we have a problem. And he's naming ideas, solutions, possibilities for the next evolution of human dignity, freedom, and expression. He's not denying the distortion. He's proposing a new direction. These paintings are not opposites. They're in sequence with each other. But Seurat's shown us very clearly what happens when liberation lacks structure, and it doesn't look great. So fear of massive transformation is very understandable. But some of that fear isn't organic. Some of it was manufactured. Signac originally titled his work In the Time of Anarchy. In ancient Greek, anarchy meant without a ruler, not chaos. Apocalypse originally meant revelation, but devolved into catastrophe. Dissolution and liberation are intertwined because they both require a redistribution of power. Words aren't neutral. They carry memory and power. Thankfully, history doesn't just tell us what not to repeat. It illuminates how humans repeatedly pick up what was left unfinished and carry forward what worked. Which is why when I visited MoMA last year and felt a familiar pull toward Nicole Eisenman's abolitionists in the park, I felt both charged and right at home. Human progress rarely leaps forward all at once. It happens in pieces. One generation tends to something real, and the next learns how to integrate it. A few examples. The Renaissance recentered human creativity, but beauty bloomed only for the few. And so some people began asking a radical question. What if authority had limits? And in came the Enlightenment to expand human rights and rationality, but emotion and culture were malnourished. At Versailles, even the highest nobility competed for the honor of handing the king his bath towel. And so a few people dared to ask whether the depths of life were worth the steep climb. And they birthed Romanticism, which, while beautiful, was also very fragile. So in came industrialization to offer structure and scale, which, of course, has its own repercussions. Progress hasn't been linear, but it has been cumulative. Each era solved something real and left something incomplete. That's not a failure, it's a pattern, one we might be ready to resolve. We're inheritors of unfinished work as humans have been for centuries. So if progress arrives in pieces, what's next? Well, if we consciously choose it, thriving may be the next logical step after all this surviving. We can address the unfinished work left to us and tend to the ground before it cracks. We don't wait for collapse to force change. We choose it and reimagine inside of instability. Humans rebuild while wounded, while grieving, while dust is still in the air. Stability isn't a prerequisite for reimagining, it's a byproduct. We've never had ideal conditions to imagine better and ask for more. We've studied the horrors of history so well that they sometimes feel written into our very human nature. So, what if we gave more attention to the moments where humans responded to destruction with dignity, cruelty with creativity, and oppression with not only survival, but the audacity to thrive? Thriving doesn't arrive automatically, though. It does ask something of us, the courage to dream and build new ways of living. If this is how humanity has ushered in change for centuries, though, then why aren't even more of us stepping forward? It's because the cost of being early is real. I've hesitated. Maybe you have too. Afraid not of the ideas themselves, but of getting something wrong or being ridiculed or ostracized. I didn't want to be naive, and I certainly didn't want to be the person who missed something important. We've all seen how moments and movements get revisited years later, and people say, how did they not see that? How did they leave that out? History makes it clear. We miss things. Some of us may recognize the blunder while it's happening, but often it's the passage of time that helps us recognize our gaps and missteps, who we left out, or what consequences we didn't foresee. Something I say, build, or activate will probably be incomplete. It might miss someone else's experience. It might create a consequence that I can't catch yet. For those of us who initiate and instigate, it's scary to know in advance that we may be criticized or dismissed, especially by people who believe that looking toward possibility means denying the horrors around us, when that's exactly what we're responding to. But I have to know within me that I have the discernment to both receive and respond to criticism, as well as know what isn't mine to carry. Waiting until something is perfect, complete, and beyond criticism isn't how progress happens. It never has been. Every era builds something meaningful and still leaves work unfinished. So I'm not attempting to get everything right. It's an attempt to move consciously anyway. Not move fast and break things, but moving thoughtfully, knowing we'll still miss something, integrating critique as best we can in the present, and trusting that others will continue the work. There is a distinction that we need to be honest about from the eras that came before this one. In the past, rebuilding often followed visible devastation. Wars meant bombed cities and signed peace treaties. There was a signal the eye could register. The worst is over. But psychological and emotional warfare doesn't end with a ceremony. Algorithmic fear doesn't sign a peace treaty. There may not be a moment when the noise stops and someone declares it safe to dream again. We may have to signal that to ourselves. This isn't a call to urgency. It's a call to those who already feel that ember flickering inside them. There has always been a first wave. Small groups, willing and resourced to experiment and draft up scaffolding for others to use when their time comes. And while we experiment or scale, we can learn more from the past, as well as different cultures and indigenous peoples to learn about what worked but was overlooked by colonization and capitalism. So if we don't wait, how do we move more wisely? History shows that when freedom moves fast, we tend to overcorrect. Justice without culture becomes coercive. Culture without structure becomes fragile. Economic growth without flourishing becomes extractive. They're patterns we've seen before. If we know that every correction needs a counterbalance and every progressive step needs deep taproots, are we willing to hold the nuance necessary to close out these cycles? To not only acknowledge overcorrection, but to attend to it. Like Signac, I know the direction we point toward matters. If we're going to experiment with something new, three capacities are especially important: remembering, imagining, and expressing. Remembering. Where can we recover moments of thoughtful responses in history, times where humanity looked at exploitation or disembodiment and chose dignity, cooperation, and creativity? Imagining. How did our predecessors create different futures from dissolution? We can be empowered wielders of make-believe until it's made real. It's in our DNA. Expressing. While reclaiming inspiration from the past, how can we support new experiments that look different from what came before? How can we respect the through lines while acknowledging these times are unlike any other and will need different approaches as well as borrowed ones? So, how do we prepare to exercise capacities like these and reclaim agency before further destruction forces us to rebirth from rock bottom? We don't reject realism to imagine futures. We respond to reality with imagination grounded in historical awareness. History doesn't just show collapse, it integrates repeatedly. And there's more than one right way to move through this, but none of them require waiting for perfect stability. Throughout history, the first people to imagine what comes after upheaval are often misunderstood. And to be completely honest, they are sometimes criticized throughout history despite their integrity. Not because they are naive or not thoughtful, but because they are early, because we are the fire starters. In the conversations ahead, we'll explore how this tension plays out in power, in systems, and in ourselves, how to mature through it rather than react to it, and ask ourselves if thriving is the next developmental step after survival, then what kind of power helps it grow? Thank you to our Patreon subscribers, as well as the intellectual companions who have inspired and traveled alongside me on this journey.